Why, hello everybody, it's Histor-Tea Time! Hello everybody, and welcome back to another segment of Histor-Tea Time with your favorite historian, me, Miss Mullins! Alright, so we're going to pick up where we left off and focus really on the 1960s and 70s for the Cold War. Alrighty, let's get started. Alright, so Joseph Stalin. He's gonna be our key guy for a little while, okay? Joseph Stalin led the Soviet Union from 1927 to 1953. He actually had a stroke, I think, was when he died. When the Cold War began, Stalin spread communism into the satellites in Eastern Europe. We talked about that last segment. Stalin escalated the Cold War by creating the Berlin blockade in 1948. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union tested the atomic bomb in 1949 and then the hydrogen bomb in 1953. Stalin signed a treaty of friendship with Mao Zedong after the Chinese Revolution. Now, my Asian, affairs with the Cold War talks about him. Stalin sent weapons to communists in North Korea during the Korean War. Now, his death in 1953 changed the Soviet Union and how it approached the Cold War against the United States. The new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, began a series of reforms known as de-Stalinization, which included releasing political prisoners and relaxing censorship. That is a big one, okay? Because remember, the Soviet Union was everything needed to be about the state, and everything needed to just be, completely nixed. There's nothing except the progress of the Soviet Union. But now he's relaxing all that censorship. He's releasing political prisoners. There's no need for that anymore. Khrushchev seemed willing to work with the USA to ease Cold War tensions. However, tensions between the USA and Soviet Union escalated throughout the 50s and 60s. Under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and then the space race began. The creation of ICBMs, which are the missiles, led to the stockpiling of nuclear weapons during the arms race. In 1961, JFK, John F. Kennedy, became the United States president. Kennedy and Khrushchev faced two important crises that heightened Cold War tensions: building of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was upset with the increasing number of communist Eastern Germans who moved to democratic West Berlin, meaning he was upset that people were leaving all of the communist-occupied areas and going to West Berlin, right? So East Germany was moving, which was under the Soviet Union. They were kind of abandoning that because they didn't like it, and they were moving to the democratic West Berlin. So, in 1961, Khrushchev threatened to cut off access to West Berlin, like Stalin's blockade in 1948. President Kennedy promised to protect West Berlin. So rather than blockade the city, communist leaders built the Berlin Wall to keep East Germans out of West Berlin. So essentially, you had this giant wall that went up, and it was like, no one's going to get over that, and no one's going to get into West Germany. So, here we go. We see the construction of the wall by the Soviets. Fantastic. How crazy is that? I mean, just... The Berlin Wall became the iconic image of the Cold War, because this was truly the dividing state. Walls and other barriers 10 to 15 feet high surrounded West Berlin. The length of the barriers around the city totaled about 110 miles. The Death Strip stretched like a barren moat around West Berlin, with patrols, floodlights, electric fences, and vehicle traps between the inner and outer walls. When Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba in 1959, the USA feared the spread of communism so close to America. After a failed attempt to overthrow Castro, Khrushchev secretly sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, and the U.S. successfully blockaded Cuba, and Khrushchev removed the missiles in exchange for the removal of American missiles in Europe. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest that the USA and the Soviet Union ever came to nuclear war. From 65 to 1973, the USA became involved in the Vietnam War. When communist leader Ho Chi Minh gained independence for Vietnam, the USA feared communism in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was divided into a communist North and a democratic South. In South Vietnam, communists known as the Viet Cong worked to unify North and South Vietnam. To contain communism, the USA sent troops to Vietnam starting in 1965. The American military used bombing raids, pesticides, and search and destroy missions to fight the communists. Here's some more bombing raids. These are pesticides and search and destroy, meaning lighting villages on fire. Despite these efforts, the U.S. was unable to defeat the communist enemy. The Vietnam War was expensive, and it hurt the U.S. economy and became very unpopular with anti-war protesters in the USA. This was one of the first times where soldiers, like the USA troops, were hated by the USA citizens. This is a big, big, big shift. Normally, veterans come home and, or soldiers come home and they are welcomed and they're, aided into finding a better life when they get back. But now they're hated. They're spit on. They're trashed. Their things are thrown at them. I mean, it's terrible. Absolutely terrible. I mean, can you imagine going overseas and fighting? Because, essentially, your government says that this is a righteous war. You're going over there, you're fighting, you're doing what you think is right, and then you come back to people that just hate you. Your own people that hate you. It's a tough situation. In 1973, the USA withdrew from Vietnam, and 2 years later, communists unified Vietnam. So, America's failure in Vietnam led to a huge change in Cold War policies. The USA abandoned its containment policy and began looking for ways to improve relations with Cold War enemies. So in the 70s, we have Richard Nixon's policy of détente, meaning easing the Cold War tensions, replaced brinkmanship. Now, brinkmanship was Eisenhower's whole mentality, meaning I'm going to be on the brink of war at any time, and if you test me, I'm going to launch absolute total destruction at you. So in 1972, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit and recognize Communist China. First gotta go over there. Now, Nixon's visit to China put pressure on the Soviet Union to negotiate with the USA. In 1972, Nixon met with Soviet leader Brezhnev to discuss the arms reduction. So essentially, let's stop making all of these weapons. Let's stop having a race. So the USA and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arm Limitation Talks, SALT, which limited the number of missiles each nation could have. That way, if we did launch missiles, it wouldn't bomb everyone to the Stone Age. By the 70s, the USA and Soviet Union seemed willing to peacefully coexist. But détente ended in 1979, of course, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to put down an anti-communist uprising. Oh no. The U.S. viewed the attack as an attempt to spread communism into South Asia and the Middle East. So the United States cut off all trade with the Soviet Union and sent military and economic aid to Afghan rebels. The Taliban. Okay. The Taliban is an entity that I feel like most people alive right now have heard of. Anyone born post 9/11, you certainly have. So this is, the Taliban is Islamic religious students, which is the Taliban. They were among the Mujahideen rebels who fought the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Various groups of students loosely organized themselves during a civil war among the Mujahideen factions that followed the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. Now, in 1996, one of these groups, called the Taliban, seized power and established an Islamic government. At first, they were very popular among many Afghans, but they imposed a repressive rule, especially harsh on women, and failed to improve the lives of people. They also gave sanctuary to international Islamic terrorists. And then in 2001, an anti-terrorist coalition led by the U.S. drove them from power. They're still out there. The Soviet Union fought in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, so about 10 years, but was unable to defeat the Afghan resistance. The war exhausted Soviet economy and proved as unwinnable as Vietnam was for the U.S. So the war renewed tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Wonderful. We're back at it again, being angry with each other. In the 80s, new U.S. President Ronald Reagan helped win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. President Reagan's strong anti-communist policies and the collapse of communist economies brought the Cold War to an end by 1991. So essentially, they were just so bled dry money-wise, they couldn't bother to fight anymore. So that's kind of how we won, I guess. Alright, so now let's talk about the end of the Cold War. The USA and Soviet Union engaged in the Cold War from 1945 to 1991. A long time. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the USA fought to contain communism throughout the world. In the 70s, the U.S. détente policy ended as the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In the 80s, two new leaders changed the direction of the Cold War: U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. You should know who Gorbachev is. He's a fairly recent Soviet leader for you guys, other than Putin. But, you know, Gorbachev was a big one. Reagan took a super strong stand against communism and the Soviet Union, and Reagan's goal was to win the Cold War and restore America's position as a dominant superpower. Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and he spent $2 trillion to increase the size of the American military. He sent over 500 missiles to Western Europe to protect NATO allies. Reagan's most ambitious program was the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI, called Star Wars, to protect the U.S. from Soviet nuclear attacks. Gee, I wonder what this looks similar to. Anyway, in the 1980s, these leaders were kind of head-to-head, okay? So this is a big, big deal. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1982, and at a time when the Soviet Union was facing a lot of serious problems. Soviet socialism did not offer incentives for hard work, so by the 80s, the USSR had low industrial and agricultural production. The Soviet Union spent 50% of its budget on the military and was fighting on an expensive war in Afghanistan and maintained troops and tanks in the Eastern Europe, so they were spread pretty thin. Soviet leaders faced the impossible task of competing with SDI and taking the arms race into space. The Soviet government restricted freedom of speech and did not allow democratic elections, so no alternative opinions were even offered. So it was just one way or you're dead. Gorbachev began 3 major reforms to save the communist system in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev introduced glasnost, which was openness, to encourage freedom of speech, to allow expression of new ideas. So you have be bold, comrade, openness, our strength. That's what this is. You can't see my finger. That's what all this is. Okay. Perestroika, which was relaxed some government controls over farms and factories to make production more efficient, and it allowed citizens to open small businesses. And then you had democratization, which allowed citizens to vote for communist politicians, but communist only. So it's not really democratic. You still only have one type of party up there. It's still only communist. In addition to his economic reforms, Gorbachev changed Soviet foreign policy. Reagan's SDI plan forced Gorbachev to admit that the Soviet Union could not keep up with the arms race. Gorbachev withdrew the Soviet tanks and their divisions from the communist nations in Eastern Europe. In 1989, Gorbachev ended the 9-year war in Afghanistan, and Reagan was actually able to work with Gorbachev to reduce Cold War tensions. This is them in front of St. Basil's Cathedral. Okay. Reagan was able to work with Gorbachev, and then finally in 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to end all medium-range missiles. I guess that's a good thing. That is a good thing. It's a very good thing. Rather than saving the communist system in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, Gorbachev reforms helped bring an end to communism. Amazingly. And so in 1989, a surge of democratic revolution swept through Eastern Europe, European communist satellites. Eastern European nations broke from Soviet control and created democracies. Gorbachev did not use the Soviet military to stop these revolutions. So, kind of kept going and going and going. And then in November of that same year, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Now, my parents actually remember this. you should, if your parents were born in the 70s and earlier, or if you just have friends, families, or if you yourself, if I have anybody that's not a student watching my YouTube videos, were alive, you probably remember this. This was a huge, huge deal. The Berlin Wall divided the democratic and the communist portions of Germany. And that wall was so heavily guarded, people died just trying to escape the communist portion of it, trying to get to the democratic section. Families were split up, friends were split up. It was terrible. Finally, in '89, it came down. So it was a big, big deal. Ethnic nationalism and desire for democracy led to the breakup of the Soviet Union from 1990 to 1991. Big, big deal. So it was dissolved, essentially. And so Russia and 10 former Soviet republics formed the Commonwealth of the Independent States. So we have Latvia, Estonia, right? So in 1990, the Soviet states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they all declared independence from the Soviet Union. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union broke apart and 15 new nations were formed. The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the official end of the Cold War. Alrighty, these are just some political cartoons. So I hope that you enjoyed this little segment with me of Histor-Tea Time, and learning about the Cold War and how we kind of get into modern era just a little bit. Not really, it's mostly just the Cold War, and essentially after that, you know, we have a coalition over in the Middle East, and by Bush Sr., he gets involved over there, and then we have issues because of 9/11, so which was in September of 2001. Essentially, that's the end of the high school 2019-2020 world history curriculum. I have had an amazing time being a first-year teacher. What a crazy year to be a first-year teacher. It's been so fun. It's been so interesting. And I just wanted to give a huge shout out to all my students. I am so very, very sad that I never got to have a proper goodbye with you. I never got to hug you goodbye. I never got to wish you well, and I hope I get to teach you guys next year for American History Honors. You guys have just been such awesome kids. You know, I'm so incredibly just blessed and fortunate to have had the honor of teaching at such an awesome high school, and also having such awesome students. You know, I think that, you know, I think all teachers kind of feel that way sometimes, you know. Some teachers are like, no, my kids suck, they're terrible. But I never felt that way. You know, I loved waking up every day to come see you. You know, if you're my student. If you're not one of my students, then that probably sounds weird. But if you are my students, then please know that you've just been amazing. And I miss you, and I think you guys are just the absolute best, and I cannot wait to see you all again. So, thank you for joining me on another segment of Histor-Tea Time. As far as required watching of any videos for my history students, you're done. This is the last stuff. This is it. You're done. Cold War, into the 90s and stuff, you're done. I may put out more videos. I think I'm going to keep up with it, do some more history stuff. It'll be kind of fun. I really enjoyed this. I've had a lot of fun. If you have any questions, if you have any requests, if you'd like me to dive into any kind of specific portion of history, just leave me a comment down below, and I'll certainly do my research and I'll put something together for you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I'd like to keep this YouTube channel growing, whether for my kids or not. So thank you again for joining me on another segment of Histor-Tea Time.